There are certain voices from the past that refuse to be silenced. They echo through the decades, speaking of love and rage and despair with a clarity that can still steal your breath away. They are the voices of artists who poured their entire complicated souls onto the page, creating a legacy that is both brilliant and brutal. But what happens when that artist is gone? Who gets to be the keeper of their story? Who decides which parts of their soul the world gets to see and which parts are buried forever? This is a story about a woman whose voice was so powerful, it became a cultural phenomenon. She was a brilliant poet, a loving mother, and a wife trapped in a now infamous literary marriage. When she died at the tragically young age of 30, she left behind a treasure trove of unpublished work, but she also left behind a husband who would become the controversial guardian of her legacy. He held the keys to her innermost thoughts, and the decisions he made would ignite a firestorm that rages to this day. This is the story of a battle over a life, a legacy, and a voice. This is the story of Sylvia Plath. To understand Sylvia Plath, you must first understand the world that tried to contain her. The 1950s in America were a decade of stark contradictions. On the surface, it was an era of unprecedented prosperity and booming optimism. The war was over, the suburbs were sprawling, and society was governed by a rigid set of expectations. For women, this meant a very specific and demanding role. The ideal woman was a perfect homemaker, a devoted wife, and a doting mother. She was expected to be intelligent, but not threateningly so, ambitious, but only in service of her family. This suffocating ideal, later dubbed the feminine mystique, created a silent, immense pressure. It was a cultural bell jar, an invisible prison of conformity that left millions of women feeling trapped and isolated, unable to articulate the source of their own unhappiness. The literary world was no different. It was a gentleman's club, dominated by male poets who wrote with a kind of formal, detached authority. Poetry was seen as a high art, concerned with grand themes and universal truths, not the messy, intimate, and often ugly details of a single human life. The idea of a woman writing openly about her own anger, her sexuality, her mental anguish, or her complicated feelings about motherhood was not just uncommon, it was considered unseemly, a violation of creative and social decorum. Into this buttoned-up patriarchal world, a young woman of ferocious talent and even more ferocious ambition was about to arrive, ready to shatter every rule and taboo in her path. Sylvia Plath was born in Boston on October 27, 1932, to Otto and Aurelia Plath. From the very beginning, she was a child of dazzling, almost intimidating brilliance. She was a perfectionist, an overachiever who excelled at everything she tried. She was writing poetry by the age of 8 and had her first poem published in a national newspaper before she was 9. She was a straight-A student, a prize winner, a golden child destined for greatness. But her idyllic childhood was shattered by a trauma that would haunt her for the rest of her life. When Sylvia was just 8 years old, her father, Otto, a distinguished professor at Boston University, died from complications of an untreated diabetic foot. Otto had been a stern, authoritarian figure, a god in his daughter's eyes. His death left a gaping wound in her psyche. She would later write, "I was a victim of the same fantasy all orphan children have, the fantasy that the world belonged to my father, and I could get it back if I was good." This desperate need to please a ghost, to win the approval of a father she could never again reach, became a driving force behind her relentless ambition. She continued her meteoric rise, winning scholarship after scholarship, culminating in a place at the prestigious Smith College. She was the star of the campus. publishing stories and poems in national magazines like 17 and Mademoiselle. She wasn't just a fragile artist waiting for inspiration. She was a disciplined, almost professional writer. She kept meticulous records of her submissions, celebrating her acceptances and agonizing over her rejections. She was driven by a burning need to be the best. One of the most revealing and rarely discussed aspects of her creative drive was her talent as a visual artist. Many people know Plath the poet, but few know Plath the illustrator. She was a gifted artist, creating intricate and beautiful pen and ink drawings her entire life. Her art, much like her writing, was a way of capturing and controlling the world around her. A detailed sketch of a shoe, a landscape, a flower. This was not a casual hobby. It was a deep-seated part of her identity, another facet of her relentless creative energy. In the summer of 1953, she won a coveted guest editorship at Mademoiselle magazine in New York City. It should have been the pinnacle of her young life, a dream come true. But the pressure cooker environment and the glittering, superficial world of fashion sent her into a spiral. The experience would later form the narrative backbone of her iconic novel, The Bell Jar. When she returned home that summer, the bell jar of depression had descended completely. She underwent brutal electroshock therapy and in late August made her first serious suicide attempt, hiding in a crawl space under her house with a bottle of sleeping pills. She was found, barely alive, after a massive 3-day search. After a long and difficult recovery, she returned to Smith and, against all odds, graduated with the highest honors. Her comeback was a testament to her astonishing resilience. She then won a prestigious Fulbright scholarship to study at Cambridge University in England. It was there, at a party in February of 1956, that her life would collide with another force of nature, the tall, dark, and brooding English poet Ted Hughes. Their meeting is the stuff of literary legend. It was electric, almost violent. Fueled by whiskey, she sought him out, having already memorized his poems. As they spoke, he kissed her, and she, in a moment of intense primal passion, bit him on the cheek, drawing blood. It was a collision of two monumental talents, two fierce ambitions, and two powerful egos. 4 months later, they were married. Their marriage was a whirlwind of literary partnership and passionate, often tumultuous, love. They were each other's first and most important readers. They lived and breathed poetry. After a brief period teaching in the United States, they moved back to England, settling in a small country cottage in Devon. It was here that Sylvia gave birth to their 2 children, Frida and Nicholas. She seemed for a time to have it all: the brilliant husband, the beautiful children, the burgeoning literary career. She had published her first collection of poems, The Colossus, to critical acclaim. But the bell jar was never far away, and their idyllic country life was about to be shattered by a devastating betrayal. In the summer of 1962, Sylvia discovered that Ted was having an affair with Asia Weville, a beautiful and sophisticated woman who, with her husband, had been subletting their London flat. The discovery was a catastrophic blow. The man she had worshipped, her creative and intellectual partner, had betrayed her. The marriage imploded. That autumn, in a decision that would prove fateful, Sylvia packed up the children and moved to London on her own. She found a flat in a house that held a strange significance for her. It was the former home of one of her literary heroes, the Irish poet W.B. Yeats. It was there, in what would be the final freezing months of her life, that something extraordinary happened. In the face of utter despair, loneliness, and heartbreak, Sylvia Plath entered the most prolific and brilliant creative period of her life. She established a stark ritual. She would rise at 4 a.m. in the blue pre-dawn cold before her children woke up, and with a furious white-hot energy she wrote, Poem after poem poured out of her, works of such raw power and originality that they would change the landscape of modern poetry forever. These were the poems that would make up her posthumous masterpiece, Ariel. They were not poems of victimhood. They were poems of fury, of resurrection, of a woman reclaiming her own voice with terrifying force. But the creative fire could not hold back the encroaching darkness. The winter of 1963 was one of the coldest in a century. London was buried in snow. Sylvia was isolated, ill, and struggling to care for two small children alone. The depression that had stalked her entire life returned with a vengeance. On the morning of February 11th, 1963, Sylvia Plath carefully sealed the kitchen door with towels, opened the window in her children's bedroom to protect them, and left them a plate of bread and 2 mugs of milk. Then she went back into the kitchen, turned on the gas oven, and laid her head inside. She was 30 years old. To truly understand Sylvia Plath, we have to listen to her. Her journals, which she kept for most of her life, provide an unfiltered, heartbreaking window into her soul. They reveal a woman of extreme contradictions. She was wildly ambitious, yet plagued by crippling self-doubt, full of vibrant, joyful energy, yet susceptible to the blackest of depressions. She writes of her own mind with terrifying clarity. It is as if my life were magically run by 2 electric currents, joyous positive and despairing negative. Whichever is running at the moment dominates my life, floods it. Her love for her children, Frida and Nicholas, was a fierce, protective, anchoring force. In her letters and journals, she delights in their small milestones, their funny words, their very existence. This maternal love is often lost in the tragic myth of her suicide, but it is perhaps the most human and relatable part of her story. The final heartbreaking act of leaving out milk and bread for them before she died is a testament to this love. It was the act of a mother thinking of her children's needs even in her final desperate moments. It speaks not of a woman who wanted to abandon her children, but of a woman so ravaged by an illness that she believed they would be better off without her. This distinction is crucial. It separates the woman from the illness that killed her. Her friends remember her not as the gloomy, gothic figure of popular imagination, but as a woman who could be incredibly funny, warm, and full of life. She was a meticulous housekeeper, a wonderful cook, and a brilliant conversationalist. She could be the perfect 1950s hostess one moment and a poet of savage intensity the next. This duality was the essence of her being. The poems she wrote in those final months are where her emotional world is laid bare with the most power. They are not quiet poems of sadness. They are loud, explosive, and often terrifying. In poems like Daddy and Lady Lazarus, she confronts the ghosts of her father and her own past suicide attempts with a kind of shocking theatrical bravado. Dying is an art like everything else, she writes in Lady Lazarus. I do it exceptionally well. This wasn't a literal boast. It was a desperate, artistic attempt to take control of her own suffering, to turn her pain into a performance, into art. She was transforming her personal hell into a universal mythology, creating a new language for female rage and psychic pain. This is the emotional core of her work, the transformation of unbearable private experience into powerful, enduring art. Sylvia Plath's death was not an end, but the beginning of a bitter and protracted war over her life and her work. Because she died without a will, her entire estate, including all of her unpublished writings, fell into the hands of her estranged husband, Ted Hughes. This single fact would ignite one of the greatest literary controversies of the 20th century. Hughes found himself in an impossible position. He was the grieving father of 2 small children, and he was also the man whose betrayal had precipitated his wife's final fatal depression. He was both mourner and in the eyes of many, villain. As the executor of her estate, he began the process of editing and publishing her final works. And it was his editorial decisions that turned him into a pariah for a generation of scholars and feminists. First came the publication of Ariel in 1965. Hughes chose to reorder the poems, removing some of the more vitriolic and personal ones, and changing the sequence from the one Plath had left behind. Her original arrangement had ended with the word love, suggesting a move toward hope and rebirth. Hughes's version ended on a much darker note. He claimed he did it to create what he felt was a better book, but critics accused him of censorship, of blunting the sharp edge of her rage to protect himself. Then came the journals. Hughes admitted to destroying Plath's final journal, the one that covered the last few months of her life. He claimed he did it to protect their children from the pain of reading it. "I did not want her children to have to read it," he said. "In those days I saw forgetting as an essential part of survival." But for Plath's devoted readers, this act was unforgivable. It was the destruction of a sacred text, a deliberate silencing of her final words. They saw it not as a father's protective gesture, but as a guilty husband covering his tracks. For decades, Hughes was hounded and vilified. He was seen as the cold, cruel patriarch who drove a female genius to her death and then tried to control her narrative. His name was repeatedly chipped off her gravestone in Yorkshire, leaving only the name Sylvia Plath. Feminist critics and poets rallied around Plath, turning her into a martyr, a symbol of female genius crushed by male oppression. This is the central, unsettled debate of the Plath story. Was Ted Hughes a monster, or was he a deeply flawed and grieving man trying to navigate an impossible situation? The truth, as it often is likely somewhere in the complex gray area in between. Hughes was a man from a different era, with a different understanding of privacy and grief. His final great work, a collection of poems called Birthday Letters, published just before his own death in 1998, was his only real public response. In it, he addresses Plath directly, poem after poem, trying to explain, to apologize, to remember. It is a work of profound love and profound pain, the final testimony of a man who had been locked in a public conversation with a ghost for 35 years. The controversy forces us to ask bigger questions. Who owns an artist's legacy? Does a family's right to privacy and protection trump the public's right to know? When a life is turned into art, who gets to draw the final lines? There are no easy answers, and the battle over Sylvia Plath's story continues to be fought in biographies, in classrooms, and in the hearts of her readers. The historical significance of Sylvia Plath is immense and undeniable. She fundamentally changed the rules of poetry. Before her, the confessional style was a minor, often dismissed subgenre. Plath, along with contemporaries like Robert Lowell and Anne Sexton, dragged the darkest secrets of the human psyche out of the shadows and into the blazing light of art. She made it permissible for poets, especially women, to write about mental illness, trauma, female anger, and the terrifying ambivalence of motherhood with a voice that was unapologetic and ferocious. She blew the doors off the polite, male-dominated literary establishment. Her work became a sacred text for the burgeoning second-wave feminist movement of the 1960s and 70s. Women who felt suffocated by the societal bell jar found a voice for their own unspoken rage and frustration in Plath's poetry and in her novel. The bell jar became a rite of passage for generations of young women, a book that told them they were not alone in their feelings of alienation and despair. Plath became a feminist icon, a martyr for the cause of female creativity. Over time, this icon's status has created its own set of problems. She has become a cultural myth, the quintessential doomed female artist. Her image is so intertwined with her suicide that it can sometimes threaten to overshadow the work itself. People are often drawn to the tragic biography before they are drawn to the brilliant poetry. The cult of Sylvia Plath is a real phenomenon, one that can reduce a complex, vibrant, and often funny woman to a one-dimensional symbol of female suffering. And yet her power endures. She remains one of the most widely read and studied poets of the 20th century because the work itself is just that good. It is technically brilliant, psychologically profound, and emotionally electrifying. She took the raw, messy material of her own life and forged it into art of timeless, universal power. Her story, in all its tragic complexity, matters because it is a story about the struggle to create, the fight to maintain a sense of self against overwhelming internal and external pressures, and the ultimate defiant power of a singular artistic voice. In the end, after all the biographies have been written, after all the academic debates have been waged, and after all the controversies have been dissected, we are left with the voice. A voice so clear, so powerful, and so unique that it managed to transcend everything, even the attempts to control it. Sylvia Plath's story is a profound and often painful exploration of the thin line between genius and madness, between art and life, between love and destruction. She was not a simple victim. She was a fighter, a survivor who endured incredible psychic pain and still managed to create a body of work that has changed the course of literature. She was a devoted mother who loved her children fiercely. She was a woman of incredible strength, ambition, and resilience, who was ultimately consumed by an illness she had fought her entire life. The question of who owns her story, Ted Hughes, her children, the scholars, the feminists, her readers, is a fascinating and important one. But perhaps the most powerful answer is that in the end, Sylvia Plath owns her own story. She made sure of it. She left the evidence in the searing, unforgettable lines of her poems, in the raw honesty of her novel, and in the secret whispers of her journals. Her voice remains. It is unfiltered, untamed, and utterly her own. It is the voice of a woman who, as she wrote in one of her final poems, became the arrow, the dew that flies suicidal, at one with the drive into the red eye, the cauldron of morning. She flew for a brief, brilliant moment directly into the sun, and left behind a light that will never go out.